for that. Yes, I think it can be. Baby, easily done. It just puts our bleachers out in the sun and have it all down Highway 61.
Bob Dylan, revisiting Highway 61. Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos, and I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College and Yeshiva University here in New York. Social movements are among the hardest of all social behaviors to understand, analyze, and predict. They're rare, episodic in nature, have ebbs and flows, and often do not accomplish what many in the movement originally wanted them to accomplish. Often the goals, the strategy, the vision of a movement as it moves along becomes more murky, complicated, compromised, factionalized, and conflicted. Yet during those relatively brief and rare episodes where historical movements of social change do occur, they can profoundly transform and affect the societies and individuals they become part of, including, of course, those who are not supporters of the particular movement. These individuals and groups might respond by trying to create counter-movements, which then could be met by counter-movements that try to redefine the struggle, creating separate periods or waves in the process. It gets complicated. The women's movement has been one of those profoundly important social movements that has historically gone through what many recognize as four waves of feminism. First wave feminism, from the early 20th century to around 1959, focused on politics, women's suffrage, property rights, and political candidacy. It culminated in the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which secured a woman's right to vote. The second wave, from the 1960s to 1980s, is usually defined by its dedication to social and economic justice, reproductive rights, and aiming to reduce inequalities in sex, family, and the workplace. It struggled to be intersectional. That is, they felt there was a need to examine the links and interconnected structure of society to include an analysis of race, class, gender, and sexual orientation. Third wave feminism from the 1990s to the 2000s focused on embracing individualism and diversity, attempting to redefine what it means to be a woman, and empowering women to define their own beauty rather than simply being objects of men's desire. Third wave feminism empowered trans individuals who were largely ignored by most feminists up to that point. The contemporary fourth wave is less universally recognized, but is said to concentrate on public discourse through public spaces, the internet, and social media. Examples are the Me Too campaign, body positivity movements, sexual assault awareness, and slut walks. We are thrilled to have on the Radical Imagination one of the most prolific and powerful young voices of the movement today. She's an author, an editor, a journalist who writes about women, sex, politics, and the economy. And her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, New York Magazine, The Guardian, Playboy, and Rookie, among many others. She is the co-author of the book, Girldrive, Criss-Crossing America, Redefining Feminism, a road trip book of essays and photography about the state of young feminism across the United States. She's worked for NBC, National Public Radio, Good Magazine, the Chicago Tribune, Splinter Magazine, and writes a regularly published newsletter called Fucking Through the Apocalypse. She's edited an award-winning anthology of her mother's, Ellen Willis's, rock criticism called Out of the Vinyl Deeps, as well as editing a more comprehensive collection of her work, The Essential Ellen Willis, which won, by the way, the 2014 National Book Circle's Critics Award for Criticism. The daughter of two of the most famous and prolific left-wing political scholar and activists America has ever produced, Ellen Willis and Stanley Aronowitz, our guest has become a major literary voice in her own right for her millennial generation and us all. Her father was on the very first Radical Imagination show almost 3.5 years ago, and I'm so pleased to welcome today Nona Willis Aronowitz to the Radical Imagination. So thank you, Nona.
Nice
it is great.
Nice to be here.
That was a little long, but there's a lot to a lot to introduce you for. And did I get the four waves correct, more or less? Or and tell us how you fit in on all this, how you became interested in writing so much about young feminism as it's struggling with its existence.
Yeah, I mean, the wave structure is common and arguably the best way to describe it for a lay person.
Okay.
But somebody has been so ensconced in it, it always seems a little bit
trite and
simplistic. Yeah, it just, I mean,
but for our audience,
but for yeah,
help us understand this monumental struggle.
Sure. I mean, I started becoming interested in feminism before it went certifiably mainstream. I'd say that was 4 or 5 years ago, when all of a sudden it wasn't that crazy to call yourself a feminist, and Beyonce was calling herself a feminist, and Lady Gaga and Taylor Swift were calling themselves feminists. But when I started to get interested in it, it was 2006 or 2005, 2006, when I was still in college. I went to Wesleyan University.
Okay.
And at Wesleyan, it wasn't a dirty word, but it was by no means universally accepted in the mainstream. It was kind of at a lull, actually.
But there it was. I mean, right?
It was. I guess so. I mean,
sort of natural.
I can't really tell, because I was, as you mentioned, raised by a second wave feminist, Ellen Willis, and so it was sort of in my blood and in the air when I was growing up. But
and you're in New York, right?
And I was in New York, and Wesleyan is a pretty, progressive leftist place, but it's not like it was something that my friends and I talked about all that much. But then in 2006, my mother died. And I really think of that as a flashpoint for my own feminism, where I had to be kind of deliberate about it, what it meant to me versus what it meant to my mother and all of the people who were reaching out to me after her death. Because I was sort of taking it for granted that I was a feminist, but I didn't really know what that meant to me or my generation. And this was at this point more than 10 years ago. I'm 34 now, but I was 22 when she died. And it was really the first time I deliberately thought about it.
So you had conversations with her growing up? What about her mother? Your mother's mother? Was there?
My mother's mother, interesting question. Yeah. She was a housewife. Or I guess a stay-at-home mom in today's parlance.
Right.
She was an educated woman who went to NYU on a scholarship for math, of all things, and just never had a career, but seemed okay with it, seemed relatively content. I don't necessarily think she had the famous Betty Friedan malaise that a lot of housewives had during that period. She had 3 children in the 40s and early 50s. And
her husband was
my grandfather was a cop, a lieutenant.
Really?
Yeah,
okay.
In New York City.
All right.
They grew up in the Bronx and then in Queens. My mom and her 2 siblings, and they were, I'd say, liberal. My grandfather had strains of sort of communism, but mostly they were liberal. They were voting for Bill Clinton.
Even as a police officer, okay.
Yeah, I'd say yeah,
right.
exactly. He wasn't. I think that it was a little different back then when there was more of a varied political stance when you were a cop. I mean, he was kind of, he had an interesting story. He was at one point a hobo and jumping the boxcars during the Depression.
As was my father.
That
so
was
maybe they met.
Yeah, maybe.
Southwest. My father took off on one of these road trips that we'll be talking about.
Yeah,
too.
so maybe it's in my
The
blood.
it's in, same here.
Yeah, well, so my grandfather was not a right-wing cop by any
Right.
means. But
so he understood what it was to be a hobo and to be down and out, and
yeah, he did.
maybe
Well,
didn't pick on people as much.
I mean, look, I didn't know him as an adult, but from what I can tell, he had a good class analysis. Race, not so much. And also feminism, not so much. I remember very specifically, it was kind of a joke in our family, in our nuclear family, about how, he was politically and ideologically pretty leftist, but then would say stuff to my grandmother, like he would sit down, with his knife and fork about to eat something and said, "Miriam, I don't see any salt on the table."
Yeah, go get.
As opposed to.
I get it.
just
So
go
like
get it.
so there's a sort of patriarchy.
He's of his time, yeah.
Well, he's the Russian Jewish. Is that correct? Or from
Eastern European.
Eastern
Jewish,
European,
yeah.
okay, as my grandparents were, and that was sort of, there's a heavy element of patriarchy there. So get the salt, or there were certain traditional ways of running the household there. So so your mother grew up experiencing that, but it doesn't sound like there was any great confrontation, and I'm sure your mother would get the salt and not think very much about it. And
my grandmother, yeah.
Grandmother, yeah.
I'm sure my mom wouldn't. I mean, I think from a pretty early age, she, if I'm remembering correctly, because she has written about her childhood, I think she was defiant of gender roles, but didn't realize that it was a social problem. She just knew she didn't want to be a housewife. She thought that was boring. She didn't want to do domestic chores. She didn't want to end up like her mother. But I think that her awakening really came when the early rumblings of the second wave movement were happening.
Right. And your awakening comes out of that tradition, and in Wesleyan there. So what your thesis was on pornography and sex roles, or sexual relationships, or?
Yeah, but what's interesting is that I did this whole thesis on 1970s porn and the sexual revolution, how it affected and reflected what was going on with the sexual revolution. This was not a thesis about like the pro-sex feminists versus the anti-porn feminists at all. There were probably a few paragraphs in there about Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin. It was more about the narratives within the pornographic movies. It was actually kind of a film social history more than anything else. And I almost stumbled upon all of this feminist and sexual revolution literature and theory while I was doing it. And I was a little bit confused. I was kind of like, wait a second, like, I thought pornography was like pro-sexual revolution, and yet there are all these feminists who are. So I did seek my mother's counsel during that time.
What were you watching? I mean, what some of the research? What were?
Oh, Deep Throat, Behind the Green Door.
Marilyn Chambers.
Marilyn Chambers, exactly. And what was interesting?
Was Robin Bird still on?
Robin Bird is great. Speaking of public access.
Exactly. And we're trying to get her on here. She was on probably during that period.
Oh yeah, she's a classic. But
it
wasn't, maybe she was on during the late 70s, but I was basically doing movies.
Movies, okay.
And the reason why I chose that, this is a whole other tangent, but
that's tied in.
I mean, because it's about film history also, which is that for 10 years there, the laws were pretty lax when it came to pornography, public displays of pornography. So there were a lot of sort of like porn auteurs, a la Boogie Nights, kind of trying to be legitimized as actual cinema. And I can't say that they ever got to that level, but what was interesting about those movies is that since they were publicly shown right before video, but after they had sort of been liberated from these regressive laws.
Not just in Times Square. When Times Square was really Times Square, not Disneyland now.
Yeah, like, you know, things like porno, sorry, I was going to say things like porno chic, but the New York Times called this phenomenon porno chic, where Deep Throat was watched by the, you know, upper echelons of society.
Yeah.
There was since these were real movies, like 2 hours of an actual narrative, you could tell how the social movements of the 60s were incorporated in these narratives, and also how porn reflected
the sexual revolution.
The sexual revolution, but also feminism and also the civil rights movement. There was all this stuff about, you know, sexual orientation in there. And so I just sort of thought that was interesting. I had seen a documentary.
Chambers is sort of the white blonde.
Like innocent, virgin whore
right,
dichotomy.
Because she was the, what was it, the ivory soap?
Yeah, totally.
Purity, and so, and
yes.
here she was now.
99.9% pure,
yeah. So here she was in these.
Yeah, but it's interesting that you say, like, oh, didn't you have a feminist awakening then? Well, not really. Like, I was kind of like, oh, this is an interesting history, but I didn't really think about what it meant to me. And then all of a sudden, when my mom died, that's really when I started to, and I wouldn't say awakening because I was always a feminist, but it was a more deliberate chapter of my life as a feminist.
And again, for our audience, when you say you're a feminist, what does that mean to you, or what did that mean to you at that time?
What did it mean to me at that time?
And
I mean, for me, it just meant that you have an awareness of how your life is a certain way because you're a woman, and that a lot of it is unfair, and that that we should sort of overcome oppressive and restrictive gender roles, and that like women and men and everybody in between should have the same rights, and that's pretty standard.
Standard stuff.
I mean, it's pretty standard. But for me, it was standard because it was just sort of the way I grew up. But shortly after my mom died, my friend Emma and I went on this road trip to ask a lot of young women about what they thought.
That's why we did the Highway 61.
Yeah.
Just in case people are trying to make a connection.
Yeah,
All
and
right,
again,
so
this was so long ago now that it seems like it's so interesting, because now I just feel like many, many young women are fine with the word feminism. It's like not even a problem.
Right.
But when we went on this road trip, there were all kinds of answers to that question. Do you consider yourself a feminist? What issues are important to you?
You went out as photojournalists. Was that the idea, and just to explore and interview and what was the purpose of the trip? Personal. What did you have in mind? What were you trying to accomplish?
I think we were interested in the topic of feminism, but knew that we had grown up in this very rarefied, specific way. Emma was also a daughter of a feminist in New York.
Right,
we were like white and Jewish and
so
raised by
fun
academics.
too. It's sort of liberating, right?
Yeah, so we just wanted to sort of
It wasn't a
get
Thelma
out.
and Louise.
No,
sort of movie,
it was
because
kind
you
of
were-
the opposite,
Right,
actually.
exactly as you put it.
Yeah.
You're going out there. You're not running from something.
Yes.
Right.
And I mean, I love the movie Thelma and Louise,
Right.
but it was a very different thing. But I think beyond that, it was the reason why we did this road trip as opposed to just calling a bunch of women is because we were 22 and we just wanted to get out there. And I think neither of us had really traveled across the country. And so, of course, like, it's like now that I look back on it years later, I'm like, God, like, we just should have gone out on the road. Like, why did we have to like make it a book? Because in some ways it sort of ruined it because we were just working the whole time.
Oh, I see.
You know, and
Okay.
it was sort of extremely ambitious of us, and I'm like in some ways happy that we did it, but in other ways I was kind of like, wow, like sometimes we were so focused on the work that we couldn't see the forest from the trees and just relax. And that's actually in the book too.
So that means you should have maybe you took another road trip then. Without
right.
the,
Yeah.
all right, well,
yeah. It's not a
you
pure
owe
road
yourself
trip.
another
It
one.
wasn't a freewheeling Bob Dylan type of road trip. Let's put it that way.
I was on a few of those, but
Yeah.
but I guess, but all right, be as it may, you
Yeah.
have this incredible book, and what did you learn from it? What did you find out there?
Oh man, this is so long ago. Again, it seems so
Well, we'll
different
get up
from what's
to-
going. No, it's
it's
fine.
only
I'm
12
so
years,
happy
was
to
it?
talk about it. It's just it's interesting to see it in context of what's going on now.
Yes,
Because
yeah.
I actually like it. I was an optimist. I still am an optimist, and there was a lot of energy that I was really inspired by. We talked to a lot of activists and a lot of
How did you meet these people? I mean, you just went off the side of the road and went to a cafe or something and started talking to people in bar, whatever. How did you? Did
that
you have
would be
certain
awesome, but no, that's how. I mean,
Oh.
like that's like
There were
kind
certain
of,
people that you were
well,
going to go see. You had on the list, or
yeah. So we really. I mean, first of all, I didn't have many journalistic skills at this point. I was 23. I had no idea really how to do reporting. So we started with our own circles, and then eventually it got like 3 or 4 degrees of separation away, and I think it really leaned. It really leaned to like a city demographic rather than a rural demographic, just for like efficiency's sake, because we wanted to stop in one place and talk to a bunch
Right.
of people.
Yeah.
But that said, like, we had this big Excel sheet, and we then
Wow. You were
deliberately
really
filled in
organized,
the
yeah.
gaps. Once we had those 3 or 4 degrees of separation away, we then sort of were saying, well, we need like a Native American woman, and we need like a poor rural woman, or a evangelical Christian woman that like our networks hadn't touched. So we went on this big long road trip, but then we sort of filled in the gaps later also,
Gotcha.
and went on like a few mini road trips here and there.
Right. So there was no universal voice of feminism that you were finding out there, right? I mean,
No, in fact, it was sort of like, I wouldn't say disheartening, because overall it was heartening. There were a lot of women who were really opinionated and really accomplished and ambitious, but the word feminism had really been dinged. Like it was a loaded and charged word. For some people, it meant nothing at all. Now I feel like there's really, through a variety of factors, it's really just a word that people have embraced again. And that was not the case in 2007.
so 2019, it's fine and accepted.
Yeah, and I think like in some ways people feel that it's been too mainstreamed, that it's lost a little bit of its meaning, but
Okay.
which is true.
Which we want to talk about.
Granted,
Yeah,
but
we'll get-
but I do think overall that's great that people don't, that you like don't have to say I'm not a feminist but anymore. That's not as much of a thing as it was 12 years ago when we embarked on this road trip.
Gotcha. And for men too.
Yeah.
I consider myself a feminist. Now, I've said that to my classes, where I taught at John Jay many years, and that would make some of the men wonder what
Yeah.
that meant. And I had to explain that. Now, when I taught at yeshiva, you could imagine that was a whole other story there. But
Yeah.
in any case, not to bum us out here about the road trip and so on, but there was a recent Times article about particularly, I guess, single women traveling around the world and the increased violence
Yes.
directed at them.
Yes.
And that's just incredibly disheartening, to put it mildly. I mean, so what do you make of that? I mean, the danger of it, and I mean, certainly in my time, there was hitchhiking all over the place. And
Yeah.
So,
Well, we weren't hitchhiking.
No.
I think we had fantasies of doing that kind of thing, but we did think about the danger element. Like
You did?
Well, I mean, because we didn't feel threatened, but we thought about how it's really curtailed female road trip narratives throughout history, where there's always kind of this dark cloud of danger threatening women on the road. That said, I mean, I felt pretty safe. We were. I'm trying to think if we ever had a scare. I mean, we had some car trouble, and I felt a little bit regretful that I didn't know more about cars, and I think that's definitely gendered. When you have car trouble and you don't really know how to change a tire or anything like that, that's certainly gendered, but I didn't feel threatened. And that might be because of the places we decided to go. We were mostly in cities.
Right.
And it's weird because I think of cities as safer just because there's more people around. I guess like at that point, Detroit was a little dicey, but not in terms of, I mean, for some reason we didn't feel that way. We were welcomed by people who knew us and.
Right, it was a rather pleasant scene that you were experiencing. So bring us a little more up to date on some of the work you've been recently doing. You've gotten recent New York Times op-ed pieces on a number of articles recently. Bella Abzug, well, that was a few years ago, right?
Yeah, that was around the Girldrive, time.
Yes, and well, let's start there and move forward on. So, you never knew her personally, but you knew of her. Did she become? Sounds like she was really a wonderful role model for you.
You're talking about Bella Abzug?
Bella Abzug, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know who she was, frankly, until The Nation assigned this piece to me. I was 22. This was also a long time ago,
Okay.
but yeah, I thought that she was cool. I mean, nowadays I wouldn't say that. It's really hard for me to have idols and role models and things like that, especially politicians, because even Bella, I mean, she was amazing, but for a politician. But even Bella had made lots of tactical decisions that make my skin crawl. I mean,
Schroeder.
Telling her that she had a baby now, so she couldn't do the job.
Colorado senator, I think it was.
Yeah, and I just feel that like politicians in general right now are not my role models. That said, Bella Abzug is a pretty amazing one.
And she made the links that I think, you tell me, most feminists haven't done, or hardly any people have done it, except going back to Martin Luther King. The links, the militarism, the poverty, the racism. I mean, she was out there on all fronts and making connections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she was very intersectional.
Okay, yeah, great. So, and she did believe in activism that also transcended just being out there in the streets, but governance, or attempting to govern.
Yes.
And now, feminists of today, do you feel that they're open to that sort of stuff? I mean, do you see Ocasio-Cortez as a burgeoning, battling Bella?
Yeah, she's great. I love her. I mean, she's very similar. She's very aligned with my sensibilities. I recognize her feminism as sort of naturally feminist and part of a puzzle piece of a larger progressive ideology, and that's kind of how I feel. I mean, it's interesting that you ask about my recent work, because for a while I was a little, like after Girldrive and after a period of time where I wrote a lot about women's issues, I felt a little bit like that was limiting and putting me in a box, and so I became a generalist, which I'm really happy about. I mean, first of all, it's
seeing various issues through a feminist lens, but within this larger understanding.
Yeah, I mean, for a while,
politics, the economy, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I was doing
class and race.
Yeah, I was doing a lot of stuff about the economy and inequality and education and all of that for years that wouldn't necessarily be considered a feminist issue at first glance, I guess.
Why not?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think anybody who actually knows what feminism is knows that they're all related. But if somebody is a layperson to the issue, they're thinking, well, what does that have to do with, women's rights? And nowadays, I think young feminists know that it's not just women too. It's sort of, there's like a gender spectrum, and that discussion is part of feminism too. And it's generally a part of a social justice narrative.
Yeah, and feelings of being exploited, oppressed, dismissed, disrespected. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, definitely. Not only that, though, I think it's like, I don't consider my feminism just defensive politics, like trying to beat back all of this oppression. I also want to say what we're for, and that's something that I've really struggled with lately with the conversation around sex. And
let's talk about it. So positive alternatives, because how do you approach that? How do you carry on the discussion with men and what's going on campuses? Because I mean, you tell me. I mean, what's your general? You're the journalist. What are some of the figures that you can really tell us that you trust here? I mean, it sounds like sexual harassment is just epidemic proportions.
I think it is.
Okay.
I'm not trying to minimize that. I think it's really important that we're talking about sexual harassment and sexual assault. But I think when we talk about that, it's easy to just assume this defensive crouch and not present an alternative, active vision of pleasure and mutual enthusiasm, and sort of eradicate this model of women as gatekeeper and men as aggressor. And when we talk about sexual assault and sexual harassment, we still haven't figured out how to connect that to the conversation about good sex, fulfilling sex. I think that's one of the main problems that has always plagued the like feminist conversation about sex and sexuality, is that you have to be able to simultaneously critique abuse, like rape and harassment, while putting it in the context of sexual freedom. And I think a lot of people think that they're mutually exclusive, but younger people intuitively understand that they're not. And yet we still haven't quite articulated, including me, like I'm in the process of trying to articulate those two things at the same time.
But you do think younger people are somehow getting it more? Or when you say that, what do you mean by that? That they're...
Well, I think that the third wave, so this is extremely reductive, but if you're going to put it in like the most simple terms, it's like,
for now,
the second wave was like pro-sex feminists like my mom, and like quote unquote, I hesitate to even say this, but like anti-sex feminists that assume sort of like a victimhood about sex, like we have to be protected from men's worst impulses.
And anger at men.
Yeah, of course, anger at men, and
the
which is
system
totally
that's produced them.
Which is totally justified, and I
Right.
feel like we are seeing echoes of anger at men now. Then you
Right.
have the third wave, which like the main strains of that, and the most marketed sort of like commodified strains of that is like, everything is okay, sex is okay, let's not critique women for putting their bodies on display. We're talking about like girls gone wild feminism and high heel lipstick feminism. And I think our generation is now just having like bits and pieces of both. And if I can speak for myself, I certainly have taken bits and pieces of both and all, like I'm certainly pro sex in the way that my mother is in that tradition. But I'm also, as I think she was, to be fair, very attuned to the impossible binds that were put in when it comes to gatekeeper and aggressor with sex, and that can manifest in all sorts of, violence, discomfort, etc. And then I also think that people should...
You got a little more explanation on that. So women as sexual gatekeepers.
Yes.
Which, who has what structure creates that, and what does that do in relationship to men and what they may feel about that?
Sure. I mean, I think we still struggle with this feeling of men are the ones who want sex and women are the ones who dole it out for good behavior.
If you're good behavior,
or
if you marry me and you can provide and...
Yeah, I think it
like
depends on what community you're in.
Right.
But aside from the most progressive communities, that's still just depressingly pervasive.
Yeah.
And it's harmful because
For both sides, right?
yeah, well, yeah, of course it is.
Yeah.
Because think about what happened. This is like something that I've said so much, but I'm going to say it again, is that moment during the height of Me Too where Aziz Ansari got accused of not rape, but sort of
Going beyond
coercive behavior during a bad date.
Okay.
I think that's just the key to understanding this bridge between sexual pleasure on one hand and like victimhood and violence on the other hand, which is you can still have sort of consensual sex and it still feel icky and bad, because clearly what Aziz Ansari was doing was trying to get sex from this woman who clearly didn't want it and felt pressured. I mean, and I don't think she called it rape. Maybe she called it sexual assault, but I don't know exactly what she called it.
What should have been called? And what is the responsibility of the woman in this case?
Well,
do you think?
Listen, I don't want to blame her for whatever happened, but I do think that what prevents
there's got to be
sexual
affirmative
assault,
consent. Is that?
yeah. Well, so yeah, I think that in certain, like enthusiastic consent, affirmative consent is its own complicated issue, but I think at bottom, it's saying you shouldn't want to have sex with someone who doesn't really want to have sex with you.
Okay.
There's just, I think like little boys and little girls, before they learn anything, should learn that. You shouldn't want to try to convince somebody to have sex with you who doesn't want to have sex with you. And even if you do get a yes from her or him or whoever, does that person really want to be there? Is that person like dying to do it? I think that's a really good rule to live by, and a surprising amount of people on all across the political spectrum just don't live by that, including women. Like they think like they sort of sublimate their own sexual desires and they manage men's instead, and that's a terrible thing.
In other words, their sexuality, their pleasure is subordinate to what they think men want. Is that what you're?
Yeah, or like fending off men's expectations, or always trying to keep men's expectations and desires in mind. Like, I don't think that there's a space after all this time and all of these decades for women to sort of pursue their own desires and fantasies and also feel safe. And I think in my personal life, I've come across where it's like, sometimes I'm trying to express myself sexually and think I'm with somebody safe, and then they sort of take advantage of the fact that I want to express myself freely because they think that's sort of a license to disrespect me. And I think a lot of women feel that way too. It's like, on one hand, we've been told like, of course, women like sex, go out and get it. And then there's still this feeling like, oh, well, if that woman is liking sex and pursuing sex, well, she's a slut who, can now be disrespected.
Yeah, I see. So the men have a lot of work to do on this too. I mean, and there's really, I think you've written also talked about men's liberation movement, which has been sort of pretty lukewarm and really tepid, and not really advanced very far, has it? I mean, hasn't really taken off.
That's a very complicated issue.
Well, we've got Tell us a little bit. We've got time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that not very many people of my generation realize that parallel to the feminist movement, there was sort of this minor but visible men's liberation movement where men were trying to examine their own participation in oppression and how they're a victim of gender roles too, and how if they can't express their emotions or anger, it ends up hurting people around them and hurting themselves. And then it's sort of, and I agree with all of that, but I think that movement was incomplete. It didn't have a class analysis, it didn't have a race analysis, it certainly didn't have like, it certainly kind of downplayed misogyny, like it was sort of like, oh, we're all equal victims. And it's like, well,
didn't take it seriously.
That ignores the power
dynamic.
dynamic.
Didn't really examine, go very deep, it sounds like.
I think
in
it depends. I think some individuals went pretty deep with it, but whatever these consciousness raising sessions were, they weren't really interrogating like misogyny and violence and and harmful energy like that, and the power dynamic that men just inherently have over women, or not inherently, but sort of,
It's worked out
at
that
this
way.
point socially, yeah. But I think like nowadays, it's like gotten so much better. Men now know that misogyny is bad and the patriarchy is bad, or at least some men know. And yet sometimes they really have trouble applying those principles to their own life and their own behavior. I mean, during Me Too, we've seen a lot of progressive men. In fact, it doesn't really seem like it correlates with politics, really. There are some progressive men, there are some like right-wing men, and they're all kind of doing the same things. And so I think there's a lot of cognitive dissonance.
Business world, sports world, media, all over.
Hollywood. I mean, Hollywood's supposed to be, this bastion of liberalism, and yet there are all these insane misogynists, like really intense misogyny going on in this ostensibly kind of not libertarian, but libertine institution. And so I think that's been a real disappointment. Not that we didn't know that before. I think any woman really knows that, but that's been part of the public discussion in a way that it really hasn't. And that's great. I think that's a good start.
Do you think the role of, how much would you put emphasis on drugs and alcohol?
When it comes to sexual assault?
Yeah, as part of that, or the confusion that comes about and how far to go, and, being able to say no and this and that. How much do you think that is coloring this interaction?
I mean,
on campus, I guess, in particular.
Yeah.
If you're putting yourself in that position, and whatever, getting high and so on, and however, aren't you? I mean, what happens there in terms of the rules and regulations when one person is semi-wasted, or both?
Look, when you tell a woman not to drink as a way to prevent getting raped, I mean, that's advice that, like, I guess is practical, but it's certainly putting the onus on her and certainly not tackling the real issue, which is misogyny. There was actually just a study about this that was like, and it seemed like an Onion article, or it was like, the headline was something like, study shows that, like, toxic masculinity, not alcohol, is the main factor in rape. And it's like, well, duh. I think that.
So that where does that rage? You're absolutely right. So where does the rage come from with the hyper sexist, masculine sex? Where does that rage? Where does the Trumps of the world, who are blatantly so angry and so misogynist?
Where does it come from?
Yeah, and do they have a sense of that? Where do they get that? The idea that they can just do this, and it's personal, it's interactional, it's structural, it's part of this a system that fosters it, and yet he gets away with it, and tens of millions of men in particular, and women, seem to give him a pass. Yeah. It's not just him, of course.
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, women can have internalized misogyny also, in the same way, any marginalized group sort of has self-hating tendencies.
Right. Yeah. Jews or blacks or whatever.
Yeah, and I think a lot of women across the country are just sort of like, like boys will be boys, whatever.
Locker room talk.
Yeah, and I think a lot of white women in particular sort of make this calculus of, should I vote for this candidate that's going to sort of uphold the status quo, which includes power for white people, for rich people, for all kinds of people who are...
So the racism trumps it then,
I think
in a sense.
In a sense it trumps it, because racism has in some ways always been about protecting white womanhood, especially racism against black people and against immigrants. Sort of the violent rhetoric around minorities, the implication for just hundreds of years has been like, you have to protect your white women. And I think a lot of white women have internalized that and are saying, well, this is a better calculus for me to have some modicum of power to just vote with my husband. And I mean, that's an oversimplification, but I think that's a huge factor. But I also think this is like what made me want to write about men's liberation and see like how far they'd come, because I do feel as if there's a huge gap when it comes to people addressing men's misogynist anger. Like there's nobody progressive talking to these guys. Like the people filling the gaps are like the MRAs and Jordan Peterson and Paul Elam. Like progressive men are not even dealing with these other men, and I just feel like that's
the role
big
that they
problem.
really have. Yeah, it is. Wow, there's so much to go. I wanted to get into the women's march and some of the issues, the very disheartening issue of anti-Semitism and or alleged anti-Semitism and the struggles that are going on that we see within the women's movement as well, or not just within the women's movement, but what do you make of that? What are women dividing along lines that are just unnecessary? How can we stop this? How can we overcome this sort of bad behavior?
Yeah, well, I think I might not be the best person to talk about the Women's March in particular, only because my position is that I'm not really sure why it was like it's now like a yearly thing, and it seems kind of silly, like to just have it, like, I don't know, like the March on Washington, like Martin Luther King's March on Washington happened like one time, and then that's great. That was the historic moment, and
it wasn't going to be a yearly thing.
Yeah,
yes.
like I'm not really sure why it's a yearly thing, but in terms of the anti-Semitism, I think there's a baby bathwater situation. I definitely think that was an issue, and I understand why people were very upset about it, but I don't think that it fully disqualified the Women's March. Like, I don't think it should have been, and it didn't.
As much of a problem as it.
Yeah, I don't think it's. But the thing is with, like, if I can talk about this generally, I think like feminism has so much like infighting. It just sort of has this reputation for having a lot of infighting. It's partly because we're talking about such a huge segment of the population that it's really, really hard to just get women and like, and also like trans women and cis women all together, because we're talking about millions and millions of people. We're not talking about 10% of the population or 5% of the population. It's like, it's so hard to come up with one issue that really unifies women or like feminists, you know?
Well, such as in Israel, we hope to have one of the founders of Women Wage Peace. I don't know if you're familiar with that movement in Israel, where Palestinian and Israeli women are joining together on marching in an anti-war movement. I mean, that's what I would also, as a feminist man here, I'd love to see this happen within the women's movement. I mean, it should be a natural. I don't know how that sounds. I mean,
it's just it's like there's so many priorities that different people have, and I think a lot of women of color feel really torn between like racial activism and like feminist activism, and like feel very frustrated by people who don't understand that they collaborate with each other. Like people with sort of multiple marginalized identities often feel very frustrated about being put under this big, like,
take care of me first, in a sense, or look at me first.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, it's sort of like it's.
Are you writing about this now? Are you grappling with these large issues?
I mean, yeah.
Does that interest you?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that, like I said, I never wanted to limit myself to just writing about feminist issues, and I think that was the whole reason why. Like, I felt a little bit like, I mean, I'm interested in it right now because I'm doing a lot of research about the second wave period, and I'm really concentrating on gender and sex, but then there's this nagging feeling like, there's so much that was left out then that like is not left out now in the current dialogue, and like that's kind of why I left it for a while, because, and again, I always use my feminist lens, but I was doing a lot of other reporting on the economy and politics and millennials and generational politics and things like that.
Yeah, gosh, and we only have a minute or so left. do you see it also within a socialist framework?
Yeah, I really do. I mean, I think that's where my dad comes in.
Yeah, I wish we
Yeah.
spent a little more time on that, but
Yeah, no, I mean, seriously, I think that the recession really radicalized me and my generation as like really exposing the harm of capitalism. And I think like the AOC generation have just been kind of like it's actually kind of been a long game, like ever since Occupy, I guess.
Yeah.
Like Bernie and AOC like didn't come out of nowhere. Like I remember just the fallout from the recession is really radicalizing me.
And
really,
channeling the rage in more appropriate ways to the oppressive structure that's bedeviling us all.
Yeah.
Nona, this has been terrific. I really thank you so very, very much for coming on The Radical Imagination. Congratulations again on your work.
Thanks.
Continue with your efforts. It's just really heartwarming and very instructive to have you on today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you again. This is Jim Vrettos here on The Radical Imagination. We'll see you again next week, and we're going to go out with Janis Joplin. I Want to Love Somebody.
There's a land, certain kind of land, honey, but it never ever, no, it never shone on me, no, no. Oh, baby, but I want my whole life to be live with you, babe. So what I want, I wants to be living, loving you. There's a way. Whoa, everybody say you can do anything. You can do every little thing, and I think I can, yeah. But what good, honey, what good can it ever bring? 'Cause I ain't good to you with my love. Oh, honey, I can't find you with my love, and I've been looking around for you now. But you don't know what it's like. No, you don't, no. You don't know, honey, you don't know what it's like. Wanna love anybody? Oh, babe, I wanna talk about it to you sometime. The way I love you, babe. And I've been loving you, babe. In my brain. Oh, I can see your face again, honey, and I know. I said I feel I got to know my own frame of mind, yeah. But what good, honey, what good, what ugly good can it ever bring? 'Cause I can't find you with my life. And I said I can't find you, baby, and I've been looking around everywhere, yeah. But you don't know what it's like. No, you don't, you never ever did. You don't know, honey, you don't know what it's like. Wanna love anybody? Oh, honey, won't you let me try and talk about holding you now? Now, baby, yeah. But you don't know what it's like. No, you don't, you never ever did. I said, I tried to show you, baby. I tried to help you, but you know you never, ever. No, you never, ever. No, you never, ever. No, you never, ever. I know that you know that, don't you know you let me